123，123。
test test 有吗？有吗？
那他如果从来走去123，123。
Shall we start? Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our IPSAS weekly seminar. My name is Wenqing Lu, Associate Research Fellow of this institute. And today we are going to have a talk on the Taiwan Triangle, China, India, and the United States. And we have two speakers. The first speaker is Professor Dr. Patrick Mendis. And Dr. Mendis is a former American diplomat and military professor during the Clinton and Bush administrations. And now he serves as a Taiwan Fellow in Taiwan and then teaches at National Zhenji University. And also he is a Senior Fellow of the Taiwan Center for Security Studies in Taipei. And today we have our second speaker is Dr. Antonia. So she is a faculty member of the Jalalian University in Krakow. And he is a visiting scholar in our institute. And she was also a Taiwan Fellow, I guess. And then she also visited in Dangang University. And I think both of them specialize in the U.S. American foreign policy and also the India foreign policy. And today they will give a talk on the relationship between U.S., India, and Taiwan triangle. So without further ado, let's give the floor to Professor Mendis and Dr. Antonia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And also, thank you for coming. I'm very honored to be here. This is my second time. I came many years ago with Seneca, Academia Seneca and Ministry of Defense to give a talk here. And ever since I've been coming back and forth to the Taiwan. So today, my colleague, Dr. Antonina, and I are going to talk about US, China, and India relations, and how these three countries working together and how its impact on Taiwan. So we are pretty much focusing on Taiwan, but it is a complicated relationship. We probably go around many dimensions to speak about this. So for the preparation for this one, what we are trying to do is I'm going to give a brief introduction, US-China relationship and Taiwan, and Dr. Antonina is going to talk about India-US relationship and also China relationship and how it related to, especially to Taiwan, because she's a specialist on Indian-China relations. And then I will return to talk about Taiwan and how Taiwan is going to deal with these three countries in our views. And she and I also wrote and written about this subject and published elsewhere in the US and several other countries. Then finally, we are going to open up for you to talk about what we think about this relationship, how its impact on Taiwan and other countries as well. So here, this triangle we are talking about is a triangle between and among US, India, and China. In the middle is Taiwan. Here what you can see, the color coded in a different way. US and India relationship is like warming up, and I tell you why and how it evolved over the years. And then India's China relationship was for a while warming up and not so recent time. And Dr. Antonina will talk more deeply on that issue. And then now the US-China relationship also very pretty much hot than in the past. And then US-Taiwan relationship is pretty warming up, and in the last 4 years of the Trump administration, and it is continuing in the Biden administration as well. So when you look at this relationship, they are all interconnected and interlinked. It's very hard to figure it out, so we thought how can we simplify it and separate these issues at the same time? How can we understand this complexity and between and among these countries and in the region, how it is evolved and where it's probably going to go. So here, for a long time, US Central Intelligence Agency, and even now, their view of China has not changed officially. The National Intelligence Estimate of the Chinese Communist Party foreign policy in 1965 is the same as pretty much now. And 2 years ago or so, and the US-China Commission sent a report to the US Congress, and it says main objective of the Chinese Communist Party is to maintain power and ensure that they have the power in the Western Pacific Ocean region and undermine the US influence in the region. And then they wanted to acquire critical technology and political influence not only in the region but also in Europe as well. Then also the undermine EU ability to coordinate China policy with the US and other countries. And then also the suppress the criticism and also promote a positive view of the Chinese Communist Party. And then on the top of that one, when President Xi Jinping came into power, and he initiated that One Belt, One Road initiative. Now it is called the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. So throughout this time period, the main point was to maintain China's influence in the region and expel the US from the Western Pacific. And US policies over time has not pretty much changed. It's pretty much now coming back to the same thing that we had in 60s and 70s and onward. And even during the Kennedy administration, Department of State says containment policy. The spread of communism at that time was the US policy. Because of that time, former Soviet Union was with the Chinese pretty much controlling the especially Southeast Asia and rest of the world and Africa and other Asian and Latin American countries. So US wanted to have at that time to contain that spread of communism. And now pretty much it is that ideological basis is still there. But now it's containing the expansion of Chinese influence, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. So these things are coming to more focus during the last 4 years during the Trump administration. What is interesting is because of the certain policies passed by the US Congress and certain documents and memorandums released in public by the Trump National Security Council, many things cannot be changed. And then Biden administration need to continue pretty much the same policies just like Trump administration put forward. Okay, so given that one, so over the past several years, the things had changed. Now pretty much return to come to the original idea of what the US maintained that policy is the main containing the spread of communism. So now what is important is because of Belt and Road Initiative, it has a way of getting to their ends. What is their ends? How do you going to get there? What is the means? So this is the kind of national model that President Xi Jinping combined with the kind of rejuvenation of Chinese culture and Chinese national history. So there they wanted to have this model based on 2 dynasties, which is pretty much Chinese, which is one is the Tang dynasty going westward from ancient capital of China, Xi'an. And then other one is the Ming dynasty, and when Admiral Chung He went to the South China Sea and to the Indian Ocean all the way to Africa. So all these things, which is obvious, is what I said was combining these 2 dynasties, Western going westward to the Tang dynasty during the Buddhist monks and merchants and going to all the way to India and to the country I was born, Sri Lanka, and has also pretty remarkable historical connections to that island and China, which we are going to talk about a little bit later, and the same as the China's connection to Taiwan as another island. So here, securing Taiwan is the end game for this, because this is the long march that Chairman Mao Zedong went Yan'an. It has not finished. When Chiang Kai-shek came to here and established his exile government, and someday Chiang Kai-shek wants to bring this Republic of China together. But the circumstances of history is that communism took over under Mao Zedong, and they have a PRC, now you have a ROC, so you have two different government entities. So, but this is a long march, is Mao Zedong, and under President Xi Jinping, is to secure the final objective is securing Taiwan and push the Western influence from the second island change of Western Pacific. And the ways to get there is first, they need to control the East China Sea, which they are dying with Senkaku Island, have a conflict with Japan, and then the South China Sea. And also you probably know about fortifying the Spratly and Paracel Island, and also you have a Taiping Island, which is kind of dormant in a way, but it's not very pronounced in this struggle between the Paracel Island and Spratly Island. And the way to do it, that's very important. It is through the BRI. And the other form is the legitimacy of the RMB, Chinese currency, yuan, making it global. And the other important part is the securing the maritime security to the South China Sea, pretty much bringing back that Admiral Cheng Ho, the travel to South China Sea and to Sri Lanka and to the Indian Ocean and the eastern part of Africa. So now this shifted during this COVID-19, and prior to that one, because of the high technology, they have a technological digital Silk Road. Now it is pretty much is the health Silk Road, because of the providing medicine and also other equipment, health equipment to the other countries, and even to recently to India. I think Dr. Antonina will go into deep onto this one, because she's specialized on these issues on the South Indian continent. So then, what is this situation change? That's when the Soviet Union expanded this influence in the world, and we need to have a balance. And when we change that our recognition of ROC into PRC, when historic visit by the Richard Nixon and that time Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State. So here, then when during the Jimmy Carter's time and National Security Advisor Brzezinski, so they introduced this Taiwan Relations Act, which was a recognition of not anymore ROC, but to change into the PRC, People's Republic of China, from Taipei to Beijing. So now, many years later, the situation changed, and it was become more obvious and more pronounced during the President Trump administration, last 4 years or so. So there, during that time, they introduced the Taiwan Travel Act, and most importantly, I think, is the Taipei Act, which passed 2019, and then the last year, Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act. In addition to this, the legal framework that provided by the US Congress, there are other things are happening in the previous administration to the current administration, which is the new arms sales to Taiwan to protect Taiwan. This is a part of this strategic ambiguity. And now, because of this congressional act and also the high-level official visit, and they are talking about bilateral trade agreements and so forth, now this is the strategic ambiguity coming into little bit clarity. So there is a state of clarity is emerging where it is going to go. The official position of the Biden White House is to maintain the status quo. but in actuality is something else happening, and this is a dynamics changes and relations that is still evolving. So given this one, which I think is a Taipei Act has a far-reaching implication, which we yet not recognize, and one is to promote a democracy and to act a buffer to China, and because China is forcing other countries to bend into their will. And now US wanted to, instead of having a partnership with China, they wanted to have a partnership with the US. And that way they are going to do is, the ways they are doing is economic security and diplomatic engagement with these other countries, especially Southeast Asian countries. And then how you are going to do it is through this Indo-Pacific strategy, that doctrine that introduced by the previous administration, and to secure the maritime transportation network in the Indo-Pacific region, Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So this one, there is a kind of shifting of that policy of ambiguity of the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 to pretty much of the Taiwan Relation Act, Taiwan Travel Act 2018. In a way, pretty much we are recognizing Taiwan, and we have a high-level visits that happen. Former Senator from Connecticut, Chris Todd, and two deputy secretaries came to Taiwan last month to signaling this pretty much the message. In still the ambiguity is there, but there is also clarity. Is the message is clear to Taiwan and also to Beijing. So now this maritime security is a very important one, is because of the Taiwan Strait has many activities going on. For example, when these three American leaders recently visited, and the Chinese military aircraft entered into the Taiwan ADIS identity zone in the southern part of island near Kaohsiung and to the south of Kenting area and the north of Taiping Islands and Bashi Channel region. So pretty much they are saying is we are very acutely aware of your activities. We are sending the message and putting the pressure on it. So this one is very important, again, going back to the history. History, the General Douglas MacArthur, when he was the commander in the region after the World War II, and he said in an important memorandum to the President Harry S. Truman's White House in 1950, it says, Formosa in the hands of communists can be compared to an unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender. So if we lose that one, we lose the American power and military and the Navy's power in the Western Pacific. So therefore, we need to maintain that island, and because of the America's national interest and the national security interest in the Western Pacific. This idea is, which I talk about, one of the article published in the Johns Hopkins University, Rendezvous is Destiny for two unsinkable aircraft carriers, which I try to combine by looking at the Chinese foreign policy, what they are doing in the, not only the Pacific, in Taiwan, and but also in Sri Lanka, in the Indian Ocean, and there's because there is India's big brother to the north, India has its own issues with China. Okay, so therefore there are two aircraft carriers. One is Taiwan, which was recognized by Douglas MacArthur, which I think there is another one, which is Sri Lanka, which I can talk about because I don't want to divert our conversation from Taiwan to Sri Lanka. So here, but China at the same time have their own two aircraft carriers. One is Liaoning, which they bought it from Ukraine or former Russia, and they renovated, and then they went to the PLA Navy in 2016. But then now they have another one, domestically produced, Shandong aircraft carrier, which also send in a clear message to the world and also to the Western powers and America the name in that aircraft carrier as a Shandong, because Shandong is the province. It is the cradle of Chinese civilization where that Confucius and Mencius was born, and they wanted to send the message because it was part of Germany and then part of Japan, because what happened in the World War I and World War II, and that's also that history is bringing back. That is what President Xi Jinping said, the rejuvenation of the Chinese culture. Get our territorial integrity to the Chinese culture, which is a proud nation before the colonial powers came into the east part of the Asia, China, 500 years ago. Portuguese and Dutch and colonial powers came in, and even to Taiwan, colonized by all these powers all these years. So given this one, this also send in another message, psychological message to the world, those who are fully aware of the history, in at least the last 100 years, okay, or until the end of the Qing dynasty, when the Sang Nutsun came in, created the ROC in 1911. So now this is the two unsinkable aircraft carriers are Sri Lanka and Taiwan, and Sri Lanka is critically important because of its history with China goes back to 2000 years. It's much longer than the mainland China's relationship with the island of Taiwan, because it goes back to the end of the kind of Ming dynasty and part of the Qing dynasty and onward. But Sri Lanka's relationship is a more affinity between Buddhism and culture, and exchange in diplomatic and relations between the Sri Lankan kings and emperors in China is very critical to the Chinese identification of rejuvenation of great Chinese culture, because they had the power at that time. Okay, so and Sri Lanka also have a diplomatic relation for 2000 years ago with Europe, and European emperors and also the East China Chinese emperors during the Han dynasty to onward. Okay, and even during the Tang dynasty, Swansan and Faxian went to Sri Lanka and stayed and brought the Buddhism to China and so forth. So now you have these two unsinkable carriers because of the history matters. Remember that China is a civilizational state, is still continuing. That's the only state in the world that the civilization is still pretty much continuing in its sense. The Babylonian and the Hindu-Jarappa civilization or the Nile civilization all vanished, but one civilization is still continuing is this. So this is going to be important because of that the civilizational state. Another one happened to be India. India has a great civilization, but it happened to be a democratic one now. After independence from British in the late 1940s, and it continued to have a parliamentary democracy. And now things are changing under current Modi administration, this Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, and which I think my colleague will emphasize more on that one. What I wanted to emphasize was in the first, this recent collaboration with China is not really recent. It goes back to the Bush administration. I was at that time in the State Department and George W. Bush administration, and I was a little bit familiar with the US-India Nuclear Cooperation Treaty, which I later published in the Johns Hopkins University Science European Journal, which I thought is security for sales, that America is selling this security nuclear technology to India because of this relationship. They probably see something is happening in which we didn't know at that time, okay? And this is evolving, that relationship is now continuing step by step, and you can see this is a non-alignment policy of India is just like a name only. Is there non-alignment? Is there very good in the paper? What is happening is something else. Because of that part, my colleague will expand a little bit. And now what we have is the most recent, which means last year, they signed that BECA, Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospatial Intelligent Cooperation. and Dr. Antonina is going to emphasize a little bit, pick on from there, then I shall return a little bit later.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such a nice introduction. Thank you to Academia Sinica for inviting us and for letting us share the results of our research. It is actually a very good question whether India is still non-aligned, or actually we should ask whether India has ever been non-aligned, right? Because theoretically India has always been on a stand that it does not want to join any of the blocs of the Cold War, but in fact at the backstage behind the curtain it had its own policy, maneuvering, especially with the Soviet Union, so this non-alignment or neutrality was pretty much a form of a mask. However, when it comes to the recent tightening of India-US relations, we should probably also ask a question whether it is alignment or is it just a partnership. Actually, we had that short discussion last time when I was here. I had my individual lecture here at Academia Sinica a few weeks ago. Perhaps it's just a matter of looking for a proper name. Still, naming is very important, and I will come back to this issue a little bit later. Anyway, if we look at the military agreements between US and India, we can see that the last 5 years brought like a speed up, a big tightening of US-India military strategic relations. And Professor Mendis mentioned the last military agreement from 2020, which is very meaningful, particularly because of the timing. Please remember, it was the midst of pandemic, October, November 2020, 1 week ahead of American presidential elections, right? So the most hot, sensitive, serious time you can imagine. And at that time, Mike Pompeo went to India, and as a part of the 2+2 dialogue, he signed the last agreement on behalf of the United States. So what does this timing tell us? It tells us two things. One thing is that the US was very determined to push this agreement forward before presidential elections, before whatever happens in the White House. It wanted to seal the deal with India. What does it tell us about India and Indian government? It tells us that India was also determined, or it decided to go for that deal, no matter what happens in the White House. Also, it was also kind of determined to seal that agreement, seal that deal. It is actually probably the best proof of the fact that India is non-aligned anymore, whatever we call it, whether it's partnership with the US or alignment with the US. India is pretty clearly showing which side it stands on. And of course, it is reasonable now to ask why India is so determined to have good relations with the United States. The answer is super easy. And of course, we can pretty clearly see that in that slide. We see the flag, we see another country's name in the title of that slide, and of course, that is China. Whatever is happening in India-US relations cannot be analyzed and cannot be understood without reference to India-China relations. And this is what I would like to focus here briefly in that part of my presentation. The last few years were supposed to bring a new chapter in China-India relations, particularly thanks to the so-called personal diplomacy between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi. They initiated the so-called Wuhan spirit in April 2018. So Modi went to China. He even initiated his own 5 principles of China-India relations, which were kind of supposed to replace the Jawaharlal Nehru and Zhou Enlai's 5 principles from 1954. But it was pretty unsuccessful. Unsuccessful because the situation evolved in a very negative way. It evolved into the skirmish that we had last year in June 2020 in Galway Valley. And I purposefully put those two pictures in this slide to show that outside, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, and their administrations were pretty good back in 2016, 17, 18 at showing China-India friendship, but the reality was totally different. The reality is what we can see in the picture on the right side. So the fence and being divided, and two military officers, right, standing face to face at the disputed border. We can trace that downward spiral in China-India relations back to 2017 and the so-called Doklam crisis, when Chinese and Indian soldiers were standing face to face at the tri-junction between China, India, and Bhutan. So it was a pretty dangerous situation, and the whole world was deliberating whether it will lead to an open conflict or not. Fortunately, it was resolved and both sides made a step back. However, China did take its, you might say, revenge. It is quite surprising because it shows us how those revenges can take place in different dimensions, not the obvious dimensions. And I'm talking about the Brahmaputra flood in 2017, which followed the Doklam crisis. So the thing is that Brahmaputra is a river which flows from Tibet, so through the territory of PRC, to India, and then to Bangladesh. And the thing is that China did not warn India about the upcoming flood, which it was supposed to do according to agreements between China and India. So of course India accused China of doing that on purpose, of hiding that kind of information on purpose. China replied that, oh, they were just maintaining some infrastructure related to hydrological data, so they could not simply share that kind of flood-related data. And last year we had a very dangerous, serious skirmish in the Galvan Valley region, as a result of which several dozen of soldiers died. It is estimated, it is officially claimed that 20 Indian soldiers died, whereas 5 Chinese soldiers, 3 officers and 2 soldiers died on the Chinese side, which is probably not an information we can rely on. Since China rarely provides really accurate, reliable information on that kind of sphere and dimension. As a result, it led to the deployment of 100,000 soldiers in total on the Chinese and Indian side along the Himalayan border, which was something that has never happened in human history before. Imagine Himalayan region, extremely harsh conditions, winter in the Himalayan region. We can imagine that summer would be pretty extreme already, so imagine what happened in the winter. It actually showed that Indian army was not very well prepared for that kind of deployment, so they had a huge lack in proper equipment. Nevertheless, this is what happened. Fortunately, February this year brought some sort of de-escalation of this crisis, however, only from the Galvan Valley region. So from that region where this skirmish took place. Otherwise, the Indian and Chinese soldiers are still there. So this is my background, let's say, and my introduction to the part related to India-Taiwan relations. So the thing is that, paradoxically, despite those very difficult China-India relations, India has always been very loyal, faithful to the One China policy, and Taiwan was, you might say, a victim of India's adherence to One China policy. A victim in a way that India-Taiwan relations has never been fully used. Their potential has never been fully used, and this is why I'm calling it the One China policy trap. It started in 1950. India was one of the first countries outside of the Eastern Bloc which acknowledged PRC. Of course, it was natural for Soviet Union, from Poland, for Hungary, and other communist countries at that time to acknowledge PRC. That was went without saying. But why was it India that so quickly, remember, only 1 year after the proclamation of PRC, acknowledged Beijing as the official representative of China, the official and the only one, the only representative of China? Not for the love of China, not for the love of communists. However, it has to be stressed that Nehru himself, Nehru, the Prime Minister of India at that time and the constructor of India's foreign policy, had great admiration for Chinese history and Chinese culture. He wrote about it in his diaries, in his texts. He wrote about it in his most famous book, Discovery of India. He actually had very good personal relations with Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, which changed with time because of political reasons, which is even more surprising, or maybe not really surprising if you take the historical context into account. But perhaps I will come back to that in a second when I will talk about the China-India border war. So anyway, India recognized PRC as early as in 1950. Why? Well, it's because China has become India's neighbor. I know it sounds like a paradox, because when we look at the map, it seems that China and India have always been neighbors as all civilizations. However, they have always been separated by Himalayan mountains and by Tibet. So 1950 is actually the first moment in the history when modern China, the China that we know today, and modern India became neighbors and were standing kind of face to face on the border line. So this kind of explains why it was easy for Nehru to have good relations with Chiang Kai-shek, because remember, Republic of China was separated by the de facto independent Tibet in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, right? So once China and India became neighbors, the situation turned out to be somewhat different. Still, New Delhi has been very firm on support for PRC and for replacing ROC with PRC in the United Nations. And that happened even after China-India border war in 1962. So even after 1962 border war between China and India, India was still supporting joining of the PRC to the United Nations, which would obviously mean that ROC would be out. And this is what happened in 1971. At the same time, because of the One China policy, there were pretty much no meaningful relations between India and Taiwan. The situation is even more complicated because of Chiang Kai-shek's government's stand on Tibet. So Chiang Kai-shek at that time and his government were stressing that Tibet was a part of China. China, which was Republic of China, because PRC and the communists were kind of occupying the part of China which still belonged to the Chiang Kai-shek government, right? So this is why they had the support for Tibet being a part of China. And this happened again when India turned NEFA, the region in northeast part of the country, to Arunachal Pradesh. So when they gave NEFA the title of a state, of Indian state, and they turned it into Arunachal Pradesh, Chiang Kai-shek government said that again, it is illegal because this is a southern part of Tibet and Tibet is Chinese. And of course we, the Republic of China, we are the only right, proper, legal representative of China. So this is another reason why India-Taiwan relations were pretty strained and limited, and if there were any, they were kind of controversial. And another interesting example from more modern times is related to the Air India case in 2018, when after receiving note from the Ministry of India's Ministry of External Affairs, the Air India changed its name on their websites from Taiwan to Chinese Taipei. So this is how they were marking the flights to Taipei and to Taiwan. Not Taiwan anymore, Chinese Taipei. Please remember, 2018, this is the time of the Wuhan spirit. So it is no coincidence that that kind of decision was taken. And it might seem it's not super important, well, especially for people from Europe, from the United States, from other parts of the world. They might say, well, what's the difference? It is going to Taipei. This flight will still fly to Taipei. So what's the difference if you call it, Taipei, if you call it Taiwan, if you call it Chinese Taipei? It's the same place. Well, not really, because what cannot be named does not exist. Or, if you prefer Austrian philosopher Wittgenstein, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. So if you say Chinese Taipei, automatically you say that Taiwan, Republic of China, the government of Taiwan, the nation of Taiwan do not exist. It's a psychological trick. It's an anthropological trick as well. Remember, naming is super important, is how we define our reality. You might say there are no facts, there are only interpretations of facts. So these are all examples of how it works. If you go to the Bible, for instance, remember in Genesis, Adam was allowed by God to name the creatures, to name the animals. Naming. So this is the way he was defining the reality. Because apart from our interpretation of reality, how we perceive it, nothing else exists. Well, nothing else exists because obviously it does exist, but to us, the way we perceive it. This is why the Air India case was, in my personal opinion, very, very important. Still, as we know, the Wuhan spirit did not survive. We had a very serious skirmish in 2020, and at the same time, we had a quite surprising tightening of relations between India and Taiwan. A few days ahead of the Double 10 Day, or the Taiwan's National Day, Chinese embassy to India, Chinese embassy in New Delhi, sent out a note to Indian journalists urging them not to cover the news on Taiwan celebrations, not to call Taiwan an independent country, not to call Taiwan a nation, not to refer to the government of Taiwan. It is a part of wolf diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy, whatever you call it, from a psychological, historical, ideological, cultural point of view. It was the worst thing the Chinese embassy could do, unless they really wanted to provoke Indians. Because remember, China, because of the 1962 border war, is a source of trauma for India. It is a historical trauma. Now China is an important point of reference because Indians would like to catch up with China in terms of technology, in terms of trade, in terms of military power. So China interfering in India's internal affairs is the worst thing you can imagine. So of course, the reaction was the opposite of what Chinese embassy expected. India covered the news on Taiwan's National Day widely. Memes, such as the one that you can see here in this slide, the middle one, circulated across Indian and Taiwanese social media with reference to the Milk Tea Alliance, or to the Alliance of Democratic Countries. And most recently, it's just like a few, we learned about this just a few days ago. Taiwanese government bought 150 oxygen concentrators and sent it to India. Since we know what's happening in India right now, the pandemic situation is not just bad, it's pretty tragic, right? So every help matters. As you can see, Love from Taiwan, written in 3 different colors, which are a reference to Indian flag, and Made in Taiwan, which is also very important. It contrasts with Made in China. We also have to remember that at the very beginning of pandemic, India was looking up to China and hoping for China's help, exactly 1 year ago. What happened is that India cancelled the deal of buying 500,000 fast test kits from China because they were faulty. They had some faulty issues. That demolished any chance of China, India, not an alliance, but at least some sort of positive, friendly gestures related to the pandemic and some sort of unity in the fight against pandemic. Now, I believe Taiwan does have its 5 minutes when it comes to Taiwan-India relations, particularly also when it comes to its global image. However, these are small gestures. We are talking about social media, we are talking about some journalist reactions, we are talking about 150 concentrators sent to the country which has over 1 billion people. So these are gestures. So how about the real perspectives of India-Taiwan relations? How about huge investments? How about huge economic deals? How about the real alliance, perhaps? So this is the point where I leave the floor to Professor Mendis.
Thank you, Dr. Antonina. You can see that where that Taiwan fit into this, the rivalry between the US and China, and also connecting through India and other countries. Other countries is the Southeast Asia. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi came into power, they had the existing foreign policy at that time is the look east policy, which means not only the looking at the South Asia, just like the Asia subcontinent, South Asian subcontinent, like Bangladesh, Nepal, and not Pakistan, but Sri Lanka and the Maldives. And Bhutan, of course, is extension of Indian foreign policy pretty much by default. India wanted to have better relations and economic and trade and investment relations with the East, which means the Southeast Asia countries. So when Prime Minister Modi came into power, this is not just a look East, but act East. Now putting into action is what Modi is kind of good at it actually. So this Act East policy is now coming into play with the larger forces that at play. Now Dr. Antonina mentioned about that China part and also the Indian Taiwan relations, and how this conflict change into better relations, and also the many of these relationships are not really a hot war, but they are psychological, as she explained. By naming things, by identifying them, identity politics, identity in their national pride and the history, that matters. So here, now the Act East policy, India is sending several messages. One into the moving South Asian to the Southeast Asia, because India has its own historical legacies prior to the colonialism came into the region. And they are spread of Buddhism or to the Hindu religion all the way to Indonesia and elsewhere in the Southeast region. So given that historical legacy, now India is acting on this look East policy to have a relationship with the Southeast Asian countries plus Taiwan. Taiwan at the same time have under President Tsai of Taiwan, she introduced the southbound policy of Taiwan, which is going southward and India going eastward, and they all meet in the Southeast Asia. So then given this, Taiwan has its own internal dynamics in the political dynamics between the two major parties, KMT, Kuomintang Party, and also the DPP, which is in power. And then there is the identity politics come also work with trade issues. You heard about the trade issues with the US, pork import, and also now more pineapple issue boycotted by the Chinese. And then when you come to the Chinese side, China is also using the soft power, and to now this turning into the sharp power, which you heard earlier saying that wolf diplomacy by China. Now also China is also acting on their foreign policy, which is through the BRI, which I explained, and to go into the Southeast Asia. Now you can see the situation in the Philippines and Vietnam, Cambodia, and Indonesia, the fishing rights issues and so forth with Indonesia. There are some issues going on in the Southeast Asia. China is acting on these issues, not only the economic trade and investment, but also using the sharp power in the region. So what is then Southern bound policy is trying to do, needs to do? He has to increase the immigration and openness, because it is a shining example of democracy in the region. And then develop trade and people-to-people exchange, which you are already doing, bringing some Indian scholars, just like my friend over here, who was in my classes in National Chenji University, Chenji Academy in Peking University, now went to India and now returned to Taiwan. So now they have more people-to-people exchange from India to Taiwan. Some of my colleagues in National Chenji Universities are MOFA scholars. So now they are also talking about strengthening the security ties with the US, and not only the US, now the current administration in Taipei looking into the strengthening the security and military relationship with Australia, because of the Australian relationship with China is also not going very well these days, because you heard about that the wolf diplomacy and internal influence on the Australian national politics and so forth, which we come back to later on. And then at the same time, because of that Taiwan connections to China, through Taishan, the Taiwan entrepreneurs and business people, and the investment largely, which actually is the dynamics that created what China is. The Taiwan technology and entrepreneurship built that dynamism in China, in my view. When you look at it, the many Taiwan entrepreneurs and investment in mainland China. So this one, how can we continue this? At the same time, China is also using the certain soft power mechanism, just like a boycotting pineapple import. What you're going to do with the pineapple then? You can have all the pineapple in Chiayi. So you need to find the markets for them. And then not only the India looking east, Taiwan looking south, there is a facilitator coming into the region now, which is the Taipei Act. Taipei Act pretty much saying, if you wanted to have a US foreign aid to these countries, you need to work with the Taiwanese. So if you want to have this relationship with America, you need to pretty much work with the Taiwan business people, academia, and then you have a brain trust over here, which I call it. You have a remarkable number of think tanks emerging, and which you didn't have in the past, and you have professors exchanging back and forth. I know my security center at the National Chenji University professors and colleagues visited India many times, and many Indian scholars coming into Taiwan. And then there are some scientists and medical health professional exchanges going on. So on the top of that one, which I also think this US facilitating role can be enhanced by the philanthropic aspect of China, Taiwan, because Taiwan is spending a lot of money, as you probably know, in a lobbying effort in Washington. And they also provided scholarships and fellowships to Americans and other countries, and especially Southeast Asian who come to Taiwan and study. And this kind of philanthropic aspect is another avenue, because when I come to Taiwan, I can freely talk about anything without fear. I can criticize your government, I can criticize your policies. But when I was teaching in China, it is very limited. I have to be very careful what I'm saying. And my good friend, colleague, and from India can see that when we are teaching about, we are very careful what we are talking about, because every corner there are CCTVs and somebody else listening what I'm talking about. There are things that I cannot talk about it, like the Hong Kong issue, the Tibetan, Uyghurs, Taiwan, and human rights. These are 5 things which I pretty much restrain talking about publicly. But we meet sometime in the park and we walk around and we talk about our classroom elsewhere in the formal setting. So Taiwan, on the other hand, I don't have that fear. Just like I'm an American, I can talk about criticize our policies, our president, our elected leaders, not personally, but the policies pretty much we can discuss and make it better. So given all these things, now India is coming to the east, Taiwan is going to south, America is the facilitator with our own laws, because it is not the Biden administration avoid, because this is the US Congress passed these laws. This is a law of the land. So given that one, there are other things are happening between the US and China. It's the trade war, especially the tech war that's going on, especially in the semiconductors, which I, matter of fact, wrote about this issue with my dear colleague at the National Defense University here in Taiwan. And we pretty much argued this is where that America can collaborate with Taiwan in the high-tech industry, which is we already have your semiconductors in like Wisconsin and Arizona and so forth. With this one, this trade war is also a spillover effect to the formed or newly forming and emerging Quad democratic 4 countries of US led, and Australia, India, and Japan. And then the 5-tech technology is another important part, because the China is also very high advances in technology, high technology communication, and also the biological aspect and the chemical aspect as well. And where this one, Taiwan, is kind of sandwiched in between. And then Taishan issue, which I talk about, many Taiwanese entrepreneurs and business people living in mainland China, mainland China, their relationship. So how these things are all, this dynamic and forces are at work at the same time. And US wanted to decouple the previous administration. Can we do that one? ABC, which I call it the supply chain, anywhere but China. Not ABC, American-born Chinese, okay? This is ABC, is the supply chain situation. There are 3 ways that we can look at it, the Taiwan, Taishan community, how the Taiwan can use that, this entrepreneurial community back to bringing into China, beginning to outside China. They can do it manufacturing, restructuring, and location changes. Some can change into the Southeast Asia, to India, and to the US. In the low end labor incentive area, industries can be moved to Southeast Asia because the labor is cheaper and low scales. And that's where that southbound policy and BRI can compete, because Chinese also moving low tech labor to other countries as well, because China is becoming more high-tech industries. So the second one is a high-end industries can be moved to the US, which is happening, and also to Europe, and that's where the markets are. And they are also high cost. And the third one is the mid-level. That one is still that China is using their own strategy to maintain and keep the Taishan there. They even passed the 31 policies for Taishan to stay in mainland China. And then we have, you have some restriction and the limitation, and if this manufacturing restructuring come back to Taiwan because of your water issues and the land issues and technology, the electricity power issues and the high labor cost in Taiwan. So these are the kind of issues that current administration need to think about it, and this is relocations are taking place at the same time in 3 different levels with related to Taishan entrepreneurial community. So now on the top of that one, the Quad-led freedom of navigation is very critical to America, because all the trade has to be freely moved in South China Sea without interference, because there are some bottlenecks in the Malacca region, and also now the China wants to have bypass that block if the US were to block it through the Kra Canal and cutting through the Thailand. And also they are using the transportation on land to have a transportation network, the BRI going all the way from Shanghai all the way to Netherlands and to London. So there are some other alternatives are taking place in order to respond to the American this freedom of navigation operation that America was advocating in the Indo-Pacific region, both in the air and sea and the land navigations. So given this one, I can say is many parts of these issues are complicated. It's a moving part. Even people who spend more time on these issues, like researchers and educators, very hard to maintain this is what these forces mean to us. But I can imagine it is harder for the ordinary citizen who have livelihoods based on other than education and research to figure it out this. In this respect, my colleague Dr. Antonina and I have tried to understand what is this meaning to us. What is these policies? What is these new laws passed by the US? What is that related to? What that means to the Taiwanese or to the Southeast Asians or to the Indian mean? Because anything that US does has an implication everywhere in the world. So that part, I give the audience to my colleague here to expand on this particular act of the US Congress.
Thank you very much. This is actually a form of summary that we wanted to prepare for today's lecture. A summary and perhaps a gate to a discussion which we hope to have after we finish this part. So as you can see, there are 2 interesting acts which are a form of the so-called US National Defense Authorization Act, which was passed in December 2020. December 2020, so just a few weeks before Donald Trump ceased to be the American president. This Defense Authorization Act can be labeled as the Christmas tree. This is how Americans call the kind of congressional bills which contain many, like dozens of smaller acts within a bigger bill. This way, it is more difficult for some congressmen to vote against that bill, because each one of them have their own bills that they want to pass within this bigger body, if you can say so. Plus, it is called the Christmas tree because usually it's being passed at the end of the year, so around the Christmas time. That explains the name. So anyway, in this very thick book, actually, you might say, not just an act, but the book. We have two acts, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act and the Taiwan Assurance Act. According to the Taiwan Assurance Act, the US wants Taiwan to raise its expenditure on defense, which obviously means tightening relations between Taiwan and the US and relying more on the US in military terms. When it comes to Tibetan Policy and Support Act, the US decided to put sanctions on every Chinese politician, every Chinese representative who will try to interfere in the election of the next Dalai Lama, which will happen, we don't know when, maybe next month, maybe next year, maybe in 10 years, but it will surely happen. And we can guess that the Chinese government will try to interfere in that election, probably will try to force their own candidate and force Tibetan people to follow their own candidate of their own choice. But the US says the US will put sanctions on every official who will try to make that kind of interference. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the US is more and more engaged in Southeast and Southeast Asia, and that is interfering or being more engaged, more interested in China's most sensitive issues, Tibet and Taiwan. Plus the timing. Remember, as I've told you, a few weeks before Donald Trump ceased to be American president, which means that Trump administration was super determined to pass those laws and make them a legal framework because, as Professor Mendis has stressed, we are not talking about oral declarations. We are talking about a legal framework. We are talking about the law which American officials now have to follow in their relations with China, with their relations with Tibet, and so on and so forth. So this tells us that all these matters are actually intertwined, they all intermingle. When we talk about Taiwan and its place in the international arena, we cannot forget about the US context, Indian context, China context. Moreover, if we try to understand what's happening between New Delhi and Washington, we had to understand what's happening between New Delhi and Beijing. If we want to understand what's happening between Taipei and New Delhi, we also have to understand what's happening in between New Delhi and Beijing. So you see, this is why we drew that second slide at the very beginning, which shows all those connections. And here again, we have that kind of triangle entanglement once again. And you might be wondering that perhaps there is a mistake in this slide, a grammar or vocabulary mistake, because we are asking what are the drivers? What are the drivers and not who are the drivers, right? Because we know perfectly who the drivers are. They are here in this picture. But what are the drivers? So what actually drives the drivers? What are their motivations? Why Washington acts the way it acts? Why Beijing government acts the way it acts? And so on and so forth. So here, as a summary, conclusion, and an opening for discussion, hopefully, we would like to stress that, again, if we want to understand international relations between those countries, we actually have to start or go back to domestic affairs. It cannot be understood what's happening between China, India, US, and Taiwan without understanding what's actually going on inside those countries, without understanding what motivates the BJP government in India with its Hindutva ideology, what's actually driving the Communist Party in China and maybe Xi Jinping personally. We have to look at the dynamics of American democracy and the transition of power which took place just a few months ago. So, as you can see, these are all very multi-layered, multi-dimensional issues. We hope we have provided an insightful, interesting, and thought-provoking presentation. Of course, it's pretty much impossible, I guess, to cover all the issues and touch upon all the aspects, but we hope that at least we managed to talk about something interesting, maybe a little bit new, and that we now we would like you to share your thoughts and maybe ask some questions. We hope it will be a good start for further discussion and exchange of thoughts. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mendis and Dr. Antonina, for the detailed and informative talk regarding the U.S., India, and Taiwan relationship. So now the floor is open, so you can raise your questions. And before you talk about your question, please identify yourself and then your home institution. Yeah. Okay, before you prepare your questions, and I can raise the first one. So, as Dr. Antonina mentioned, that we need to pay attention to the domestic politics when analyzing those international relations. And I think there's a very interesting pattern here is that both the U.S., Taiwan, and democracies, and also India is democracy. And I think I raised a similar question a few weeks ago during your talk. So there's a domestic election, so there's election cycle. But on the other hand, we know that in China, probably there will be no election in the near future, and then presidency will be in power for many, many years to come. Then does that kind of power structure affect those relationship among those countries? Yeah. For example, if there is a election coming in either U.S., India, or Taiwan, then probably those incumbent or candidate might try to manipulate the relation with China to instigate nationalism or something like that to increase their popularity. So will that be one parameter in those relationships? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. So maybe here I will relate to two issues. As Professor Mendis has stressed, that's a paradox, but for dozens of years the US policy towards China was pretty much the same. And it seems that despite the transition of power, which happened in January 2021, it seems that the Joe Biden administration will pretty much pursue the very same direction that was defined by the Trump administration. Although Joe Biden is trying to officially show that he's now focusing on American values, on human rights, on democratic standards, and he's very much different from Donald Trump. This is what he's trying to show and prove. However, when it comes to US-China relations, it seems that on the basis of all those laws and bills that we have been talking about, this direction will be pretty much the same. So in this regard, it seems that maybe the atmosphere will be not that hot, maybe the words will be much more gentle. Maybe what Joe Biden writes officially will be very much different from what Donald Trump used to write on Twitter. But underneath, the sense, the meaning will be pretty much the same, maybe. And when it comes to possible changes in India, actually, a few weeks ago, I got a question whether there might be a shift of power in India in the upcoming elections. And we were all like kind of stressing that in China, yes, we cannot really expect this kind of shift power, maybe in India, but I said that to me, the BJP probably will win another elections in a few years. However, now we can see how dynamic the situation is. I'm actually wondering how the current mismanagement of pandemic in India by the government of, by the BJP government will impact on people's support for BJP. Recently, BJP lost totally elections in West Bengal on the state level. Mamata Banerjee, the very charismatic female leader in West Bengal, won in a very exciting way, in a grand way. However, it's West Bengal. So we cannot extrapolate it and say that this is what will happen across India, because West Bengal has a different culture, different history, and has never been super pro BJP, just like Tamil Nadu, for instance. Once BJP loses in Uttar Pradesh in the north, this will mean, uh-oh, the big change is coming, and the BJP will probably lose national elections. So we will see. Right now, the pandemic situation in India is tragic, is terrible, and I guess the whole world should really unite in helping India, sending oxygen concentrators and any other equipment that is possible to be sent. But I'm actually wondering whether normal people will associate that with the mismanagement of the Narendra Modi government. I'm wondering. I'm looking at the media reports and waiting for that kind of analysis. We will see.
May I also add a few points to what Dr. Antonina said, is to put it in a broader framework. If you look at it, India, as she explained, there are domestic drivers. What drives them? Actually, under Modi, drives is the Hindu nationalism, Hindutva. It is a faith, it's a belief system. My faith is better than your faith. Mine is a religion. Yours is not a religion. And mine is better than yours. So that kind of a faith as a driving nationalism, it is part of the identity politics. And here in the US, however, this is a faith factor also, belief. Underneath that one, what drives the power behind President Donald Trump? Who was the power behind the veil, the emperor? It is also the nationalism. It is called the evangelical Christian nationalism, white nationalism. That's what is driving. Not to who, doesn't matter what drives. You can put another person there. That person drives what drives. So there, white evangelical Christian or the Hindutva is no different than the faith and belief in a communism. In the last election, about 72 or 76 million Americans voted to Trump. Biden, 82 million, I think. They are faithful Democrat and Republicans. And also there are more than 93 million Communist Party leaders, Communist Party members too. They drive their system. There is some form of nationalism, the identity politics, who we are, also drives this. And then when you come to Taiwan, you have also national identity politics, whether you are a KMT and the old part that have some kind of links to mainland China, because my connections to Anhui province or the Fujian province or Guangdong province or Shandong province, and the new generations over here under DPP, they want to look at the new. They are not experienced this communism or the dictatorship. They born into a new identity. So they have this politics going on. And then you can see the re-election of President Tsai is a rise with the Hong Kong issue, the new freedom issue. That's also part of this nationalism, what drives. Let me talk back to your first questions about that one, and Dr. Antonino also mentioned on it. Under President Joe Biden, the main thing she said to the world, under 4 years of Trump presidency, he said, democracy is back, or America is back. That's the message. Earlier, because everything is driven by America first. Who is America first? Not African American, Black Lives Matter or the Native Americans, but the white American. So now Biden comes back and said, no, America is back now. The words has a meaning, just like my colleague earlier highlighted, bringing back the Bible story. And then what is different from that one, the America First. Now the same kind of policies are not changed by the White House per se, but the US Congress put the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, constitutional infrastructure into the US government. These are the policies. This is within this framework you need to behave. American foreign policy have to behave. These are the acts which I mentioned earlier. You cannot deviate from, because these are the law of the land. Whoever comes into next, they have to pursue these laws, unless US Congress, of course, change it. And then other difference is, once you set up this legal infrastructure, constitutional infrastructure, the law of the land, America needs to go back to our own post-World War II traditions, which is we maintain and protect the values of democracies and America's founding values, which the country was based on: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as Thomas Jefferson said. So there, now the Biden administration are working with our friends and allies. The first visitor to Biden White House was not the European, but the Japanese Prime Minister, sending a message: America is back, the democracy is back, our allies and friends and partners are back. They are sending a message. So that way, the new administration in Washington is working with the friends and allies and partners that America put the framework after the World War II, which is called the Bretton Woods framework, the World Bank, IMF, and WTO, based on the democratic values. So therefore, I could say two things. There are forces that drives things. At the same time, we are people of law. In China, it's very different. Law is whatever the heaven says is the law. The Son of Heaven tell you what the law is. So, of course, they have laws. So, in America, whoever come to the White House doesn't really matter, as long as the law of the land prevails. They respect the law. That is the American trademark. That's what Biden administration intend to have, that trademark continue, because that's the envisioned by the American founding fathers.
Thank you. So, do we have other questions from the floor?
Thank you, Dr. Mendis and Dr. Antonina, for the wonderful presentation. So I have one very simple question. So, considering the worsening situation in India, do you think that the Indian or the Modi administration might be incentivized to sort of make a compromise with the Chinese government, because they are facing a very imminent crisis within their homeland? So they may have the incentive to have a good relationship with China in order to exchange for something, mask or vaccine, something like that. So do you think that might basically provides a possibility where the U.S., basically the India and China relation might have some qualitative change in the coming months or in the coming years. And if that's the case, then maybe the negative relationship between China and India is not a constant, but a variable. And if that's the case, and then if you now consider another diet where you have the China and the US, in your analysis, basically you portray the relationship as a very negative one, and that negative term might be, continue into the future onward. Do you think that also is not actually a constant? For example, you mentioned that the Biden administration might basically just perceive the way in the Trump way, and they may use very different tones, but they are going to employ very basically the structurally alike policy. And if that's the case, then maybe the future between U.S. and China will be will not be very rosy. But what if actually China could change its policy to a certain extent that perhaps the Biden administration will portray China not as a adversary but as a strategic competitor? Or do you think that is not a very probable scenario, and you still believe that U.S.-China relationship will be a very competitive one in the coming future? And so the only thing that might change basically in your equation is that, India and China, their relationship might change a bit, and therefore, Taiwan needs to think about basically there are two negative relationships on the board. You have U.S. and China negative one, and India and China negative one. In that case, then Taiwan might have very much strategic leeway to maneuver. But if those two negative relationships are not, constant, they are, they may be changed into different forms, then, Taiwan need to think twice about, choosing sides and just be very straightforward about, how we are going to employ our relationship with mainland China. So that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. You said it's going to be a simple question. It doesn't sound like a simple question, or you might say that simple questions are in fact the most difficult questions to answer, because this is just a paradox. They seem to be simple. So maybe I will focus on the Indian part and then leave the floor to Professor Mendis, who will probably want to speak more about the American issue here, or American aspect of this issue. So, of course, if we try to look back and look for the answer in the history, we might obviously say that China-India relations have always been fluctuating. So, right now, I think we are going down. So perhaps in a few months or a few years, these relations will go up again. However, we also have to stress that it's not that simple to call them positive or negative, because if we look at the economic exchange between India and China, it has been pretty good, and it has been like booming over the last few years, and China is the most important economic partner for India. So when it comes to this economic aspect, India does need China. The problem is that it has a trade deficit towards China, so in this regard it's not super positive, yet at the same time these ties are becoming more and more important, right? It is very negative when it comes to the border issue, when it comes to this military aspect and the geostrategic aspect, if we want to call it this way. I think that a lot depends on what Beijing would like to do in reference to or towards India, because we have to remember the 1962 border war was initiated by China. It was China that attacked India. There is no discussion. This is the historical fact. So I think that the final voice or the final power lies on the Chinese side. If Chinese government wants to be a little more delicate or friendly towards India, this would be possible because, as you have mentioned, India has many internal problems it needs to deal with right now. So definitely conflict is not what India wants, absolutely not. And the fact that India is now joining some sort of an alliance or partnership with the United States is not what India has always been dreaming about, absolutely not. India has always been afraid of turning the China-India dispute into a global dispute. and letting other countries, other powers join and interfere into this dispute. But this is what is happening because of the rise of China, because of India's international ambitions. So this is pretty much why it's becoming more and more serious. As I said, a lot depends on China. India's experience with China's help during pandemic was pretty negative last year, and I'm afraid this is casting a very long shadow right now. It raises some sort of awareness and suspicious if China wants to send any sort of oxygen concentrators or equipment. It might be treated suspiciously, whether it will be a reliable help or just another hollow gesture or something that will actually be useless, just like last year. So this is the India-China part. So perhaps since I'm not engaged in American politics, perhaps I'm not the right person to talk about it. I have the much better specialist here on my left side.
Thank you. In fact, you have not one simple question, many simple questions, and has no easy answers. That's why we try to present it to you, the complicating and complex issues, and what are the drivers. Why is it driving the way it is driving the world affairs right now? Let me make a little side note to what my colleague said over here. When middle of this COVID pandemic, which is originating from Wuhan, and trade wars going on with the US and China, and China is acting more assertively against the southern neighbor of India. Why is it this one you wanted to have when you have major issues going on with the US, you don't want to have another problem with the southern border? I think there is a balancing act going on the internal state council of the Supreme Communist Party itself. It is called the internal insecurity. In the American system, we see everything on the papers, in very public. It's a kind of opening up the dirty laundries. Right now, who is going to be elected and the leadership from the Republican Party, or who is driving this and that. We can all see that. Even in the very dynamics of your parliament over here, legislative yuan, when you get angry, we go even physical about things, we express you things. And this is happening in other democratic countries. But in China, order and stability is very important. You can see there's a Congress Party meetings. Everybody looks like the same, breathe like the same wave, and everybody agrees with everybody else. And to me, it's very interesting how that Confucian culture trying to remain. At the same time, behind this, all the formulation of these policies are very dynamic, actually. Then you actually see the centralized democracies at work at the local and the provincial level, and even the government level. But when you come to the public display, you don't put the laundry on the front of everybody to see it, because it's a cultural kind of traits that coming in. And it also tells of the other things, insecurity of the leadership, who should be leaning toward the military side of it, or the diplomatic side of it, or the trade side of it. Okay, so there are some insecurities going on. Let me come back to the other questions you asked, maybe 3 points. One is what is going on is not really a hot war over here. It's a different kind of war. It's the war of the mind. The mind. Once you change the mind, you change everything. This is what is happening in Taiwan. When American visitors coming in the previous administration, and when President Joe Biden sent his 3 representatives over here, China is also sending a message from the aircraft, military aircraft flying over your Taiwan airspace. what is that say? It says two things. One is they are looking at your domestic politics, which I earlier mentioned about it. Traditional way of looking at the KMT party, which has a connection, affinity to the mainland China and the new generation. You want to divide that. One point coming into the breaking point, the tipping point. Finally, in the Chinese mind, some point, KMT going to give up as the new generation is coming up and they wanted to have their own way of running things. Or they wanted to have a tipping point, not the status quo, or taking over China, taking over Taiwan. So that's what I call is warfare in the mind. And then to support that one, let me give you three other things, what I think is happening in these forces, the drivers. One is China is no longer responding to Americans. America pretty much responding to Chinese. That means that China leads. China leads in the sense they have a BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. America trying to come up with something. They don't have a treasury to provide the money. The military power, diplomatic power, every power rely on economic power. That is why Taiwan is important, because it is economic powerhouse. And the brain trust, which I mentioned earlier. And the high-tech center. That is very critical to project the power. So in that respect, China is doing this mind game, three ways. One is, you can see, in the past, in the colonial time, British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, is the news provider. And the Voice of America is the news provider. Their own propaganda version of it. Not saying the propaganda, but providing the news. And now, Chinese global television is more powerful. They are running their own view of the world, their own newscast. They also providing the global news now, not only the Chinese news, the global news. Then they have more people than BBC reporting. So that is very important. This is the mind game. Once you conquer the mind, you conquer the all. And the other part is, we talk about the US-China relationship is this adversarial. We are going to block the trade, import and export. Matter of fact, trade has increased between the US and China during this time period. And other part was the important part, which I think is educational exchanges. There are over 250,000 Chinese students in American universities in a given year. They provide the money to the American institutions. And when they return, they must return. Some is stayed, very small amount. When they return, they have the flavor of American freedom. But when they return, they are forced to accept the way their national culture is, because they have more opportunities back in China, in that economy, for the well-educated, American-trained Chinese students when they returned. So then, above all, China wants to tell their own story about COVID-19. They wanted to divert the world opinion. Nobody talking about now Wuhan is the origin of this thing. Now we are talking about the vaccination, and we are providing the medical and health equipment to go to these countries. That's the health diplomacy going on. So that is very important to register that one. We are not talking about the causation. What is happening right now is important. And finally, because of the American power in the world is because of the dollar economy. We can print money, which is pretty much happening. in the $3 trillion that the new budget came out from the US Congress. That dollar economy sustained the American power. As long as the dollar economy prevailed, that is why China wanted to have RMB is a global economy. For example, China is forcing other countries like Sri Lanka, for example, all the trade has to be in RMB. The same as with China and Iran and Venezuela. And if you have a BRI countries, they have more than 200 agreements with BRI countries. America doesn't have that many, but we have a military agreements, AXA agreement with over 100 countries. But China has a trade and economic agreements because they realize the power comes from not the military, but power comes from the economics. In a recent talk, my colleague from Australia over here actually wrote, we wrote an article about it, the idea, how China thinks about it. And Cory Bell and wrote about this one when I talked to the legislative yuan, which essentially said, China has the Lao Tzu, Dao's principle. Their principle is water and rock. Water can go around things and even erode the huge rocks, the power of water. America is still stuck with post-Cold War mindset of the gun and butter. Either we give you the gun, we send you military aircraft, or we give you monetary incentive to change it things. This is where might be the game is now being played. It is the military and also the economic. So the China has this is water and rock doctrine. America has a gun and butter doctrine. Of course, now the Biden administration, the way I see it, now is becoming like Lao Tzu. They are now putting the economic aspect to these countries, just like a Taipei Act, for example, if they implement it in a way, and providing the USAID programs, not cutting down our budget to World Health Organization or to the UNESCO. And China, on the other hand, when America goes down in this international organization, China is coming up. Why? Because the infrastructure provided by after World War II is a powerful infrastructure. Now China is using it. If we retreat, just like a Trump administration trying to do with the UN and the family organization, we don't have much of the power. So China using it, this is water and rock structure, the metaphor. That's where the power is, because it's ancient. Dao's doctrine is ancient than the 70, 80 years old American experience of gun and butter. So therefore, what we can see is the mind game is what is important here. Those who conquer the mind will conquer the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
Yes.
Please.
Hello, everyone. I'm a scholar from Balkan countries in Europe. I have one question according to Taiwan position now, because we always think that, and it's reality that threat for Taiwan comes from China. But being from Balkans, I know America is also a tricky player, and especially now when we all see the declines in a way. But they still do licitation with their investment in weapons. So it's like they I know in West seems, as I read, more than ever. Can it happen that if, I know, in some votes in the future, Taiwan wants to escape war and they don't have any, as a small country, they play very well until now between China and US. But since the situation's coming complicated, can it happen that if, I don't know, Taiwan says, okay, we will be with China, that America says, oh no, you will not. And then it can happen, some incident. I mean,
Yes. You know, you want me to answer. You know, predicting is very hard things to do, especially the predicting about the future. When I last year when I came in, I was planning to come to Taiwan right away in the January 1st. But out of blow, then COVID came. Nobody envisioned, nobody predicted, nobody knew about it. World change. This was the case if you look at the history. World War I, tiny little thing triggered. World War II, few things triggered. And then the world changed with the COVID that nobody expected. So when you predicting, especially about the future, it's very hard things to do. Having said that one, we always like to know what tomorrow brings. That's why many people go to church or the temple. They're looking for something that you cannot comprehend. Ask something to heaven to bring things or God to bring things. So having said that one, let me take to your questions a little bit more seriously. The choice is for Taiwan people. You probably know by the reporting, Taiwan Foreign Minister Joseph Wu said, yes, we take the responsibility for Taiwan. Of course, because there's ideological or the democratic values. Taiwan was not the democratic values until recently, same as the South Korea. Okay, and America thought the American experience might work in China. China become, after Deng Xiaoping's, there's export-oriented economic drives. Now the Jeffersonian idea might come back to China. But it took a U-turn when President Xi Jinping came in. So it is very hard to predict. Matter of fact, been going to China many years, teaching actually 27 Chinese universities and academies, travel all over, from Urumqi to Shanghai to Harbin to Hainan or to Tibet. So what I found was, it's very hard even the Chinese to predict about China. So come to Taiwan, it is also very hard to predict what will brings tomorrow. Only thing is we can have scenarios and minimize that risk of losing something we decide so dear to Taiwan, which is the democratic values, identity, and the history that matters also. Okay, history drives things. Okay, by looking at the history is not a guarantee for the future directions. Having said that one, what would happen if you were to America to do? The US government at this point wanted to continue the status quo. Even though there is a clarity is coming to focus more. That means that there is a deterrence policy. China would not take over. Who wants to have us taking over a country of vibrant, brilliant, entrepreneurial people and turn into a cemetery? Okay? That happened in human history. Look at Afghanistan. We went over there and dropped it and came back. So everybody in this world, just like you said about Balkans or former Yugoslavia, they can remember what America did to Iraq, and Afghanistan to Libya. So they don't want to have it. That is why I think is when Foreign Minister Joseph Wu said, we need to take responsibility to the Taiwan people themselves for what your choices are, not what America provides for you. Because you have affinity to your motherland, if I say so. Your connections goes back to the last of the Ming dynasty, Qing, and then General Chiang Kai-shek came over here. And this ideology drives, our faith drives, our national identity drives, the history drives. It's very hard to answer your questions, but the thing is, what I fascinated by the Taiwan people was every kitty corner, you have a shrine. China has that too now. They have a Buddhist temple and Taoist temple, and I climbed to all the Taoist mountain and a Buddhist mountain and a Confucius mountain. They have a new faith is coming in to focus. It's just very different. But Taiwan, that faith factor, I ask my Taiwan colleagues, when you go to this Shinan temple or to the Fondong Buddhist monasteries, what do you are praying for? They are praying for more money, passing the exam, and having a nice boyfriend or the girlfriend, and the nice car, and the nice flat or the apartment, and so forth. That's what they are praying for. So this is not different than what I talking about in America's national identity. When the evangelical goes to churches, they are talking about prosperity gospel, not what the Bible said so. But making money is good, but you need to give a lot of money to me because I am your pastor. So there are very, very wealthy pastors in American evangelical community who supported Donald Trump. So it is not about the Christianity that thinks, that what the faith drives. So what I was so fascinated in Taiwan, these Taiwan people have a remarkable faith in themselves or the outer God coming to rescue and the peace and happiness of their people. Then I can see my dear good friend Billy over here is a faithful practitioner of Dafeng tradition. It's a very spiritual traditional movement, which is also have in the US and elsewhere all over the world, matter of fact. And he celebrated last Saturday, am I right? At the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial. Yeah. So what you see is the faith factor is amazing. That's why I said that the faith drives a lot of things. That's what Dr. Antonina said, not to who, what drives. Whether it is a nationalism based on ethnicity, like in India, Hindutva, in America, religious nationalism, white Christian, white nationalism. So that are the drivers that we need to understand beneath everything. I leave it there because I don't have the answer, because I am beating the bushes around it rather than answering your question, because I do not have the answer, because I cannot have a crystal ball to predict the future. Even the astrologers went wrong, especially in India.
I don't have an answer either. I just wanted to make another comment here. The problem with the kind of predicting and trajectories is that we want to perceive world in a rational way, and we want to believe that all those leaders are calculating in a rational way. But the problem is that they are not machines. They cannot, this is not a 1-0 game or a 1-0 calculation. Otherwise, yes, China would not attack Taiwan, for instance, because it would definitely not make sense. But the problem is that history has shown to us that individuals were changing the direction of the world. Napoleon, Hitler, Mao Zedong, Stalin. This list can be very, very long. Individuals, of course, they were supported by people like other politicians, military leaders, and common people who followed them, but still they were on the top. They were driving, the crowds and all the political parties. So here I'm kind of referring to Xi Jinping, and it's not a secret that he has the kind of super big ambitions and that he wants to become this one and only, the greatest leader in the history of communist China. So from a rational point of view, Chinese attack on Taiwan does not make any sense. But from the ideological point of view, personal point of view, it's not really so obvious. So I'm afraid that it's not that easy to make the kind of calculations and predictions. Unfortunately, the kind of leaders can be driven by idée fixe. And I'm afraid that Taiwan is a form of idée fixe when it comes to Chinese Communist Party. Well, let's hope rational calculations will win in the end.
Yep, thank you. So do we have you first and then
You first.
yeah, please make your question short because we need to answer. Thank you.
Thank you for arranging the lecture, and thank you, Dr. Antonina and Dr. Mendis, for your comments on India, US, and China triangle. I will make quick 2 comments, and I have a question. So, regarding non-alignment, it's a big debate even in India now. Even the policymakers and the scholars are not clear whether India ever practiced non-alignment by textbook policy. But definitely in a broader perspective, broader context, India remained non-aligned given the scale of its army, given the scale of its land size and others. India never participated in third wars or never set foot in third countries, especially like Afghanistan. It didn't participate in Soviets invasion of Afghanistan or American invasion of Afghanistan. So it remained very much non-aligned. But given the not very self-reliant on the military needs, India always depended on South Soviet Union then, and now it's much depending on US. So it remained non-aligned when we talk about wars or like setting foot in third countries. And on the context of like faith factor in Hindu faith in Indian foreign policy, I very much agree that faith factor is very, very major factor in Indian domestic politics. But I don't agree to that fact, or like we are extrapolating the importance of faith on Indian foreign policy. The faith and foreign policy became a major factor when Prime Minister Modi became to power in 2014. It was not that major debate when Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the same BJP party, was in power. But it's also very important to remember that Prime Minister Modi is the first Prime Minister in the entire Indian history who visited Palestine and also Israel. And he also made the relations with Middle Eastern countries, and especially like with United Arab Emirates, Iran, are the highest under Prime Minister Modi rule than previously. Coming to my question, India, Australia, Japan, and US, or US and between its allies, the security and military cooperation is at its highest form, especially in the context of China. But there is a lot of disagreements on trade and economic needs. And it's also a major factor for Quad to realize the quadrilateral security dialogue involving the 4 countries, or like any individual policy or individual strategy in the Indo-Pacific. They have better coordination on the military and security cooperation, but they don't have any basic agreements on trade and economy. So it's very important to talk when we talk about gun and butter strategy or water and stone strategy policies. So what are we going to see, or what are we going to witness in the overcoming decade or in the coming years? The economic and trade agreements between the Quad countries, especially in the context of like RCEP or CPTPP and World Trade Organization, or like the current debate over intellectual property rights over vaccination. Thank you.
Last time, why not just add the last question, and then we will give the speaker 2 minutes to respond, please.
Okay, thanks, Professor Mendis and Professor Antonina. And my question is, the past discourse about the economic globalization is about the capital dominates the supply chain, but the states try to change this configuration now, like China and US competing for the example, as Taiwan moved factory from China to India, like Foxconn or Pegatron or Wistron in India. But China also established factories in Bangladesh or Pakistan. So I'm a little bit worried about the future. So maybe I'm just asking your opinions about that. Thank you.
So please.
Okay, thank you very much for these two questions. Yet again, these are not very simple questions, or at least giving answers to those questions is not really an easy task. I'm afraid that if I had a tea here, Chinese tea, and had some tea leaves, and it would be easier for me to read those tea leaves and tell about the future of, India and India-Taiwan relations, and would be as reliable as my rational calculation and analysis. But anyway, being more serious, I think maybe I should refer to your question first, actually, because there are many issues that should be taken into account. I think that yes, China is absolutely very active in investing in other countries, but at the same time, China is also using the carrot and stick policy at some sort. And what was happening on the Mekong River recently, over the recent months, is a very, very good example. So China has built many river dams on rivers such as Brahmaputra and also Mekong. And without giving any notice to countries down the stream, it has been closing those dams, diverting water, storing water, or just lowering the water level on those rivers. And you can imagine that when the water level drops even 1 meter, it's enough to disrupt all the livelihood, all farming or river transportation systems in the countries downstream. We are talking about Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and other Southeast Asian countries. So it might be used in the future for a blackmailing practice, because water is something that we will be fighting for in the future, for sure. Perhaps it will be much more important than fighting for territories, fighting for oil, fighting for or struggling for political influence or economic domination. Water will be the key, probably already in the 21st century, not to mention what will happen afterwards. So it is easy to imagine that China possesses many tools that it can use not only to attract other countries by investment, by development of the kind of economic relations, but also a stick to punish those who don't want to follow its policy and be some sort in a way aligned with China. So I'm afraid that we have to remember that BRI sounds very nicely and looks very nicely on the paper and in theory, but there is a debt trap, for example, that these countries, just like Sri Lanka, fall into. Pakistan, the same. It's the country which it's like a half-fallen country right now, and without Chinese investments, who knows whether the government in Islamabad would be still there and how this country would be functioning. So these are the double sides. This is like the one coin with two sides of those Chinese investments. And I guess at some point, sooner or later, all these countries, all these governments will realize what the cost is for accepting all those Chinese investments.
I will answer. In a way, when I was thinking about when Viresh asked this question, and you, my friend, let me paraphrase your question. So one, Viresh, you're talking about the power of faith, the belief system, the Modi government, Hinduism, okay? And he was also talking about yoga, promoting yoga, and which okay with me, because I'm doing yoga myself and meditation, so it's fine. So that's very important in the political context in India is concerned. So there we have a Hindutva nationalism going on. It's a religious version of it. And when you talk about the US, the triumph of the President Trump's, the evangelical movements and the evangelical faith that the white evangelicals supporting this candidate because of the culture war going on, like abortion issues and the right to life issues and immigration policies and all those things are the drivers, but Trump happened to be the figurehead, the front man for this one. So there is that movement going on, evangelical Christian, especially the white nationalist part of that, behind that one. That's why he reluctant to condemn the white nationalist supremacist, and also not to acknowledge the police brutality or the Black Lives Matters, and those issues are kind of sidetracked. Now the new administration is upfront and changing the police reform and so forth, so on. And then when you look at the communism in China, and they have this is their way of doing things greater. The communism is what makes China out of poverty. 600 million people out of poverty. Now rural development going on the like Gansu province, Ningxia and Xinjiang and the western part of the provincial province of hinterland of China, compared to the maritime system which are much more developed and economically very wealthy. So there is this underlying theme, whether it is a Hindutva or Christian nationalism or the communism, because they are morally superior, they are better. And that morality is very important. My religion is better religion than your religion, kind of attitude in the nationally. And then that's morality, superiority of moral sentiment is very important. And then my Taiwan friend talking about economic globalization, which is the other driver, because economic globalization, underneath that one is about wealth creation. That is why Taiwan is, even though very small island, so powerful, because of dynamics. It's created the entrepreneurial people, highly educated workforce, talented in high technology, and so forth, because that wealth creation, they are the one of the 4 tigers in East Asia. So now you have a morality drivers, and they have a wealth creation drivers going on. Your question about the faith and your question about economic globalization. This was the foundation of America also. If you look at the America is driven by the 2-line railroads. The one railroad is driven by the pilgrims who came to America, who were looking for the religious freedom, worship. Others who came prior to that one was the colonists. They wanted to make money. So therefore, they wanted to make creation of wealth. That is, the America was the experiment of these 2 pilgrims and colonists. One wants to have a religious freedom, another one also wants to create a wealth. And there America balanced these 2. And one was driven by the Alexander Hamilton's economic theories. America needs to be a manufacturing nation. And at the same time, Thomas Jefferson said, nope, America has to be democratic and freedom to religious freedom, which he was championing. This is the practical about America. That's why America was so powerful and successful, because we have a religious freedom at the one hand, and we have economic globalization and economic freedom on the other hand. As an academic community, for us, is there a theory? Of course there is a theory. Before America was created, somebody named Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, wrote 2 books. Only one we know about very often. It is called The Wealth of Nation. It was published the year America was founded, which is 1776. But less known one is more powerful and important, which was, he published it in 1753. It was called the theory of moral sentiment. We have this compassion for other people. We need to have this one. So therefore, what you are asking is we need to have economic development, because when you are hungry, we don't need anything. We want to take care of our stomach, hunger. And once you have the hunger, we need to fulfill our spiritual needs. So you have this both has to be sustained. Only it's sustained in where freedom is reign. Not in a communist country, the heaven mandate everything else for you. Not you mandating what your destiny is, but somebody else doing it for you. So therefore, that's what I think is still America is the best country in the world. Thank you very much.
Yep, okay. Thank you for Professor Mendis and Antonina's great presentation today, and thank you for attending our seminar today. And before ending this seminar, I would like to make an announcement that on this Thursday, the day after tomorrow, we will have another talk on how South Korea talks about middle power diplomacy in a changing world. So the topic is highly related to today's topic. So I look forward to see you here. And we have some audience watching the YouTube, and thank you for watching the YouTube, and probably we will have another online broadcasting of our seminar soon. So thank you for attending this, and hope you will be well during this pandemic time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good question.